This is my favorite quote from Joy of the Gospel from Pope Francis, Evangelii Gaudium. Almost without being aware of it, we end up being incapable of feeling the compassion, outcry of the poor, weeping for other people's pain and feeling a need to help them as though all this was someone else's responsibility and not our own. So this is this whole issue of Pope Francis, this culture of indifference. And we have to ask ourselves as Catholics, have we really been guilty of this culture of indifference? Have we become indifferent to the silent violence of poverty and to racial injustice in our metropolitan region? Why is it so difficult for white people to talk about race? You know, you have to think about this one a little bit. But there's a great book that I read a couple months ago called Right Fragility. Robin DiAngelo is a facilitator who works with diversity. She's a white person. She works with a colleague that's African American, and they do diversity training. So she has lots of experience of how people react. And she's coined the term white fragility. And when I thought about myself, here's how it goes, okay? If somebody came up to Ray Fitz and said, Fitz, you're a racist, what would I do? Immediately, I would become defensive. I'm a pretty decent person. I look at the things I'm trying to do in the community. How can I be a racist? But it's because we think about racism as a binary. You're a racist person or you're a morally good person. You can't be someplace in between. And what this book really got me to do was to begin to examine, yes, there's some great activities, some great things that I do as a person, but I have been socialized into the American culture. And I have more slides, but I'm not going to do it with, it's to show how this socialization takes place. If you look at the media and you compare how blacks are portrayed against whites, you can see there's a strong kind of orientation towards demolition of blacks and portraying them as weak, as violent, a whole series of things that I think are important. So I think what I found in this particular book was, yes, I have white fragility. If you challenge me, if I get into a conversation on race, I have to watch for my defensive hackles coming up, right? I have to ask myself, okay, listen, and just try to be vulnerable to what people are telling you about their experience, about what they think about what you're doing, and again, take that white fragility to the table of conversation. It's important to do that. Again, just some things about racism. I do think that we have to look at how prejudice, the implicit biases that we have, and institutional power interact to create racism. I think it's important to see that our biases get translated into institutional structures. And again, one of the things I said to the bishop is, why didn't we use the white privilege term in the pastoral? Well, that would have been somewhat explosive, I'm afraid. But the point is that all of us that are white are walking around with privilege. We didn't earn these privileges, they're just there. You know, I can't sit here and say, well, I don't want those privileges. I got them. I'm made who I am by those privileges. But I have to realize that other people don't have the same privileges that I have. And people of color, it's a lot harder. So, again, the whole notion of racial injustice says that the way the organization of the region is, white people have access to privilege and opportunities, and they're denied the same level of access to people of color. So this concept of opportunity is a very important one in racism. Okay, healing the fractured city and the church. So if we have a fractured city and a fractured church, how do we begin? One of the things I think we need to do is to recognize that these issues are very complex. There's no simple answer to them. There are also a wide variety of perspectives. As, you know, we saw the differences in perspectives and experiences of the two neighborhoods. And they erase really strong emotions. You know, I've been engaged in a lot of these kinds of conversation, and the emotional temperature just rises up pretty quickly because people have strong feelings about them. The important thing is, how do you get people to exchange ideas and viewpoints on a focused question. That's a very controversial one. So, for example, in one group that we're working with, what community supports would help you raise your children? And just listening to that conversation, just trying to move through that, not making judgments, not saying, oh, you don't really see the problem. No, how are they experiencing the issue? Or what are the causes of racial injustice? Now, one of the things we've learned is there's a certain dynamic to these conversations. It's not as neat as this little thing says here, but the first thing you do is got to open up space for people to really express their feelings and their ideas about it, where people are listening in a very deep way. You want to get a shared pool of meaning. And then as you move through that, you want to get a focus on what has come out of our dialogue. Are there some different ways of looking at this? And then take some periods of deliberation to evaluate how those answers have come out. It looks pretty neat there, right? But it's a pretty chaotic process. You just have to keep your eyes on moving it where it needs to go. But I think this concept of a conversation is what we need for healing. So I'm going to talk about two types of conversation that I think are important. First one I call conversations of friendship. I'm sure if Pope Francis said anything about it, he would say conversations of fraternity. But, fraternity doesn't quite go over in the United States the way friendship does. So it's, again, bringing diverse people together to share stories and experiences. Okay, it's important that they're able to understand the issues of racial justice, what's happening with our children. And the goal is, out of that conversation, is just to develop perspectives on the issue of racial justice. How do we see this particular issue? Now, I think it's important to have a good format for these opportunities. You need to really facilitate. You need to tell people the ground rules of the conversation, how you're going to work together. You need to give people plenty of time to talk. I mean, if you think you can put it into a framework, okay, we only got 45 minutes for this dialogue period, it's the wrong way to run this thing. Dialogue is going to take longer. One of the things I do think is provide refreshments, right? Refreshments all seem to do something with hospitality. And I'm a big advocate for making sure you document what comes out of the conversation. A type 2 conversation is one that we're actually working on, and some people in the audience are part of this conversation. How do the network of Catholic organizations, the schools, the churches, the universities, the religious communities, how do we align the services that we have to better serve families and children in opportunity-poor neighborhoods? How can we bring that together, okay? Now, if you think that's an easy issue, you haven't tried it, okay? In the language that we use at the center in Ron Heifetz, it's called an adaptive challenge. You're not going to be able to take any expert knowledge, get a new information system or some other technical ways of solving the problem. You really have to start engaging yourself in new learning and innovation, and it really requires a change of heart and perspective. The participants really have to be able together to own how they frame the challenge and to invent appropriate solutions. You're not going to be able to solve this in one single conversation, and you're going to have to develop ownership for the problems and solutions over time. I think, as the bishops have said to us, as Catholics, as Christians, and people of goodwill, we're called to make the journey, as I said in the beginning, to truth, to really understand racial injustice and how we're part of creating that racial injustice. We really need to move towards justice. We need to catalyze organizing ways to bring greater justice. And we need to be brothers and sisters. We need to have reconciliation.